Good evening again. I'd like to call the committee of the whole for the Village of Cary for February 15th, 2022 to order with roll call, please.
McAlpine? Here. Pavelli? Here. Dudek? Here. Collier? Here. Walrath?
Here.
Weinhammer? Here.
Thank you. Would you join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Now going to the public comment, where the public is invited to make an issue-oriented comment on any matter of public concern not otherwise on the agenda. Anybody would like to address the committee of the whole? None said. We will close that at 6:14. Now moving to our main discussion is regarding TIF, which is a tax increment financing district. Turn it over to.
Yeah. Good evening, Mayor, Village Board. We have here Phil McKenna, our TIF consultant from Kane McKenna. Phil, I thought since you brought your wife Debbie, maybe she'd be doing the presentation, but I guess it's gonna be you.
Might be. Surprises.
But welcome to Phil. This was an item at our last or previous committee discussion or board discussion. The board wanted to learn a little bit more about TIF districts, how this might be beneficial to be used as a tool to incentivize Maplewood property development. Since we haven't enacted a TIF in probably over 15 years, I think, it was also a good refresher for staff and elected officials here, and even our residents too, to learn about how a TIF works. So Phil's going to do what I call a TIF 101 discussion for the village board. Any questions that you all have, just want it to be a free-flowing conversation here, and certainly we can have questions at the end. And if we need to have Phil come back for additional questions, no problem with that. So we'll turn it over to Phil for your presentation.
And if you want to go to TIF 102, that's where my wife comes in. So. Thank you. I'm president of Kane McKenna Associates. We've been around for a while now, 38 years this year, and we specialize in delivering services of a financial nature to municipalities throughout the Illinois area. So we are working with a lot of your neighbors and a lot of municipalities throughout the state. The tax increment financing is probably one of the most widely used tools of economic development. And I think from our standpoint, it's important to think about it as a tool for economic development. It's not good, it's not bad, it's in between. It's something you look at, see if it can help you, and if you do, then you use it prudently. Any area within a local government, more than 1.5 acres can be designated as a TIF, as long as it meets certain criteria. But it's not just for urban areas, or just for rural, or just for farm, or just for downtown areas. Tax increment financing districts normally last up to 23 years. That's at the discretion of the village board as well. How does TIF work? Well, you basically take an area, and it's either vacant land or underutilized properties or pure blighted area, and you say this is an area where we think that if we have some public input, we can leverage more private investment to come in and increase the taxes in this area. So what you're doing is saying that the taxes that are paid by future development are full taxes, 100% taxes. But it's going to go into two pots, and I'll illustrate that in a minute. One is the base equalized assessed valuation, which is what the property is paying now in terms of its taxes. And then there's an increase that presumably comes as a result of a successful TIF. That increase is put into a separate pot. So the property owner is paying just the same amount of taxes they pay with or without TIF. But it's a separation of one pot to encourage, incentivize future development, and the other pot to keep it as it is. So funds can be used by a whole list of purposes, which we'll get to in a minute. What types of projects do you see in TIFs? You see redevelopment of substandard buildings, vacant buildings. You see a lot of public infrastructure financing be used to clean up polluted areas, improve the downtown area or any business district area, because TIF funds can also be used for rehabilitation of projects. To provide infrastructure that's needed to develop a new site. Algonquin has just started a TIF district in the industrial area in order to prepare that land for industrial development. I'm not positive, but I think almost all their funds are being used for infrastructure that wasn't there to begin with. TIF is a tool that fits in with your other tools in terms of a planning aspect. The economic development goals, I'm sure, are set forth in your comprehensive plan, also for the area, for individual areas as well as the village as a whole. So it's really, you're starting with those goals. What are the areas that you think need some improvement? You're translating that into a TIF plan if you choose to do a TIF. You're saying, based upon these principles of our comprehensive plan, we're forming a TIF plan. And from that TIF plan, we're gonna express different objectives, plans, strategies that are important, because we're relating it all back to the planning process. In that respect, I say TIF is a finance tool to carry out what your planning projects are. This is the buckets that I talked about briefly before. So on the right, that's where on the left, that's where the same taxes that were paid on the property before, they go and they're distributed as they always are to all the local governmental units. The bucket on the right is the incremental revenues, the money that's coming in as a result of the private investment. That's put in a special fund held by the village and designated by the village board as to what improvements it can pay for. It's over a 23-year period of time, so it could be, used effectively for infrastructure at the start, might be used for rehabilitation further down the line. A budget is prepared in the process, and that's something that the village board input is very important on. That description of the two buckets is, I think, the clearest way to identify what TIF revenues are all about. If you have a successful TIF, the graph would look something like this. I'm colorblind, but I think it's a red line is the base amount, and the blue line is the incremental revenues that are going up over time. Obviously, everything's not perfect, but not as intended all the time. We saw gaps in that back in 2007, 2008, when we had the Great Recession, and we saw some gaps around 2019, 2020. But on the other hand, we've seen more accelerated growth in other situations. How do you become a TIF? Well, there's a couple ways to qualify an area. One is the so-called conservation area. That's if in the area more than 50% of the buildings are 35 years of age or older. You have to meet that threshold. It's non-negotiable. If you then, on top of that, meet 3 out of the 13 criteria that are set forth there, you can designate a conservation area. The criteria have to be present to a meaningful extent throughout the area. It doesn't mean that every building has to meet the criteria. It doesn't mean that one building must meet all 3 of the below factors. It means that the area as a whole represents a conservation area where, besides the age of the buildings, where you can find these factors on the rest of the property. There's also okay, let me go back. Okay, then the second criteria is a blighted area. That's if you don't have buildings that are more than 35 years of age. In that case, age is not a factor at all. In the same 13 factors, you have to meet 5 instead of 3. What the intent of the state law is that to the extent that you're taking a current area and improving it, say particularly through rehabilitation of structures, that it should be less difficult to get qualification on that basis. You could also be a vacant area, vacant blighted area. If you are, you have to meet 2 of the following factors. I won't read them out, but set forth up there. Or you meet 1 standalone factor. Unused quarry, for example, one of Crystal Lake's original TIFs was a quarry. No, unused railroad tracks or yards. Chronic flooding. An engineer comes in and says this area as a whole is subject to chronic flooding, and until you fix that, you're not going to be able to get redevelopment. Unused or illegal disposal site, or was blighted immediately prior to becoming vacant. So you can, on a vacant land site, if you have one of these standalone factors, you can designate a TIF district. What's the process? We sort of put these steps up because they speak, I think, to the length of the process that's involved and the checks and balances the village has. First, you identify what are the geographic area that you would propose as a possible TIF district. Then an analysis is performed of the proposed TIF district to determine whether or not the area qualifies. And that's a sort of back and forth. That's, you know, we identify what criteria need to be there. Staff comes back and says, what is there? We look at historical records, your comprehensive plan, everything else. So that's a process that in itself is probably a month to 2 months. If the area shows the criteria necessary to qualify as a TIF district, then an eligibility report is prepared and presented to the board. A redevelopment plan is also presented. The redevelopment plan is like the budget, the goals of the area, any particular things that a village wants to emphasize in the area. You know, for example, if it's street repairs that you want to focus and emphasize on, you put that in the redevelopment plan. It's certain things that are required by law, but a lot of things that aren't required by law that speak to what your own comprehensive plan is. So you also establish what's termed an interested parties registry. That's for full disclosure and transparency in the process. Anybody in or outside of the village that wants to be informed of every step of the way, wants to receive all the documentation, signs up for the interested parties registry. Typically kept in the clerk's office. As long as somebody's on that registry, they're going to receive all of the paper, all of the analysis that's been done throughout the process. The municipality also sets up a joint review board. That's other taxing districts. Other taxing districts do not have a right to say yes or no to a TIF district, but they do have a right to meet and to go over all the material that's being considered for it. It's virtually every taxing district except for mosquito abatement districts or really small districts, but the county, community college district, township, any park district, library district, they all meet. They have to meet at least once. They can meet as many times as they'd like over a 30-day period of time. They come out with a recommendation. It's a recommendation to the board. The board doesn't have to follow it. If there's some disagreement between the joint review board and the village board, then there's a 30-day period of time in which negotiation must be attempted to see if you can come out of that. Besides the notice to the taxing districts of the joint review board meeting, you're also invited to the public hearing. The public hearing is held about 30 days after the joint review board meets, and residents within 750 feet are also notified of the public hearing, so they can attend if they'd like to hear more. The public hearing happens and notice is published twice in a local newspaper. After the public hearing, and that can sometimes be 3 public hearings. It could be continued just like any of your public hearings. After that, the village sends out a notice to taxpayers with records within the TIF district for the public hearing as well. After the public hearing, the governing body has not less than 14 days nor more than 90 days after that public hearing can adopt the TIF ordinances, again, if it so chooses. If the ordinances are adopted, the clerk files them with the county, and the county actually does the accounting of mechanism in terms of if incremental revenues are produced. I put this one in because there's certainly been a lot of consideration throughout the state on what about the other taxing districts, and are they protected? They are in certain ways, and I just made a quick list of them. If there's any money used in a TIF for residential purposes, there's an immediate set aside for possible new students. It's a set aside of up to 40% of what the increment may be. It's dependent upon how many students actually come in. So if 10 new students come into a residential development that was funded in part by TIF, and if the average state cost per student is $10,000 per student, then $100,000 is actually set aside in that year. $100,000 has to be at or less than 40% of the totality of what came in from the TIF. Usually that's not an issue one way or another. There are new students that are coming in, so if it was students moving from one address to another address within the same school district, that would not be an offset. Library also gets an offset in terms of new patrons. Up to 2% of the TIF increment set aside for any library new patrons that are a result of the TIF district. Funds can be used for renovation or new construction of schools, libraries, parks, have been, and I think increasingly municipalities are looking for that. Are there other ways they can help out their other taxing districts? The usual impact fees or charges that you have in place with respect to schools, parks, libraries, et cetera, they're still there. They're not impacted by a TIF district one way or another. And finally, intergovernmental agreements, which is becoming, at least in my practice, I'd say, more common to have school districts say, well, gee, maybe we won't get any new students and we still need some money over that period of time. And if there's consensus on the board that, yeah, that can be done, there are ways that through intergovernmental agreements, there could be some sharing of TIF revenue. If in any given year, the TIF revenue is not used or pledged under some ordinance or indenture or provision, anything that's left that doesn't meet those criteria is surplus. And it must be distributed to all the taxing districts, including the village, on a pro rata basis. So simply speaking, if a school district, elementary school district is 30% of the tax bill, they would get 30% of the surplus. If you're probably 5 or 10% of the tax bill, the village would get 5 or 10% of the surplus. There's an annual audit that has to be done. There is state monitoring of the audit and the submission. There are also annual joint review board meetings. So there are different ways to add transparency to the process. Some of them are built into the statute, and others are ones that just by a good government basis you can look at individually. So that's the summation of the presentation, Mr. Mayor.
And can I ask one question before we get into this? Do you have any knowledge through my Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus conference call this morning about the proposed Senate bill, voted up 2298?
2298.
Thoughts on that?
I'm told, I'm not good on those odds, but I'm told that the odds are real small.
Yeah.
It was introduced by Senator Gillespie, who was in the Arlington Heights, Palatine area. She introduced it last year, and it went down pretty badly. Actually, it never got to a vote on the floor at all. It basically would take the guts out of a TIF district, because it would take it down from a 23-year life to a 10-year life. When you think about good planning, it's gonna be 3-4 years till you get something that you can really count on. And then to ask somebody to finance something for 7 years thereafter isn't very viable. I don't know, at the same time, what's kind of interesting is you can go for an extra 12 years on a TIF, from 23 to 35, but only if you get all the other taxing districts to say yes, and the legislature to pass an additional 12 years. Well, this senator introduced a bill for Palatine to take one of their TIFs to 35 years. So as you scratch your head and you say, well, wait a minute, you're trying to kill TIF on the one hand, but you're trying to give one of your constituents an additional 12 years. So long and short, Mr. Mayor, I don't think it's going much of any place, but I think IML is leading the opposition, and I think good support to the IML is well called for.
Thank you. The only reason I brought that up is I brought up the fact that we were investigating this possibility tonight. So I just so happen to have a consultant with us tonight, so I thought I'd get your opinion on it. Just, do you guys get the general whiff of what's going on? It's going to probably fail miserably, but I figure you all should be aware of what's being set up. But, any questions from anybody? Go ahead.
So that new student set aside, is that a one-time payment or is it every year set aside?
Every year.
It is. Okay,
Every
so
year.
it could be
So it's when the funds come in, if there is a set aside, you literally have to set money aside until a proper accounting is done. You know, let's say the school district says there's 10 new students, you know, they've got to submit the names and addresses of them. Your staff looks over them, but the money's set aside there. It can't be used for any other purpose until you know how much has to go to the school district.
Okay, and then thanks for that. And then my second question, which I may or may not have a follow-up. In your experience, when an area is designated a TIF, it was formerly a public use area, and then it transfers to a private use development. Is that sort of the perfect storm scenario, because the tax base initially was next to nothing to begin with, and it's moving now to a private use where the tax base potentially could be pretty significant.
It does provide for about the maximum TIF that you can provide for, because you're going from a zero base up to, and one of the things, just from an intergovernmental standpoint, it is possible for municipalities to say, well, recognizing that it's a zero base, we'll take, if you will, instead of 40% off the top, we'll take, 20% or something off the bottom. We'll make sure that a certain amount is declared surplus to make up for the fact that it's a zero base. Has been done.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Kelly, you have any questions?
No, I think, great job.
Phil, there was one question that came up when I was talking to a board member about successful TIFs. Obviously, not too far away from us is Palatine, and they've done a pretty good job there. And they're downtown, and a lot of that redevelopment happened, via TIF dollars. But projects or communities that you've worked at where you've seen TIFs be successfully leveraged for development. I think Director Simmons had talked to you about Vernon Hills or some other examples that you may have.
Yeah, there's a number of malls that either have gone through the TIF process or are going through the TIF process, basically for their salvation. So Vernon Hills is actually, is a good example in terms of two projects on either side of Milwaukee. On the Hawthorne Mall side, that was made into a TIF. Can't remember which store was torn down. I think it was Carson's, but whichever one was torn down. There's apartment buildings going there. That's going to be some build out for some sort of streetscape improvements there. The other side of the street, which was all vacant land, heavily flooded, is now metal. What are they calling it now? It's a whole new development. And why can't I think the name of it? Hawthorne Melody used to own the property, so Melody Farm. That's what it is. Melody Farm, and that's retail, casual food restaurants and residential as well. But it can often be used for industrial. I mentioned that the project Algonquin's currently undertaking. And riding up here, it came from the south and right up Road 31 in the Spring Hill Commerce Center in Carpentersville. That was a TIF district. It was vacant land beforehand. Had all sorts of problems with the land contour. You could use TIF for other purposes where, I'm thinking of Lincolnwood, where it wasn't a downtown area, but a prime area along Toohey Avenue where the so-called Purple Hotel was there. It had become a real blight on the community. They tore all that stuff down. That's new retail. Morton Grove had a similar area on a major retail street, and they now have a new mall come in there. I guess they're not malls anymore. They're called lifestyle centers instead. So it's sort of like if you look at, well, what are you looking to get into the community? What fits with the planning? You can figure out, TIF's been helpful in just about all those ways.
I do have
Thank
a
you.
question. And we kind of chatted about this, but is it up to us exactly what we want to incorporate into the TIF? So in other words, for our purposes, we'd be looking at Maplewood, which is a vacant piece of property at this point.
Right.
We also would be looking to extend it further, perhaps, say out to Cary, Algonquin, or whatever we wanted to, however far we wanted to go. Do we have limit on that, or as long as we meet the criteria, we get to decide what all can be in there?
Basically, you get to decide, but there are some monitors on that. One, it all has to be contiguous. There's actually fairly recent court rulings that I'm sure Scott can elucidate on in terms of the contiguity and the call for that. It all has to be within the village, so that, I'll use that Algonquin one as an example. That actually was unincorporated land, so that the same night they adopted the TIF, they had to annex the property in there. The other thing is that if you're going to include current residential